Have you ever wondered what it would be like to just a broken bar step back in time? Not to the world of kings and queens you see in movies, with all the shiny armor and grand feasts. I mean the real past. What if you could spend a day, just one day, as a regular person living 800 years ago? Would you survive? The truth is, behind all the romantic stories of knights and castles, there was a much darker, grittier reality. A world where life was incredibly tough, often short, and filled with dangers we can barely even imagine today. Forget the fairy tales. We're about to pull back the curtain and see what life was really like for the everyday person in the Middle Ages. Let's begin our journey by picturing a town from that time. Imagine a collection of timber-framed houses all huddled together, crammed inside a protective stone wall. Thin trails of smoke curl up from the chimneys, a sign that people are starting their day. You'd hear the constant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer hitting an anvil, the distant shouts of a baker pulling fresh loaves from a clay oven, and the steady hum of a weaver's loom. The ringing of church bells would be the only clock people had, marking the hours of a long, hard day. In the narrow streets, which were really just muddy paths, kids would be running around, chasing chickens and stray dogs. At first glance, it might seem kind of peaceful, almost cozy, but that feeling wouldn't last long. The moment you took a deep breath, the illusion would shatter. Life in the Middle Ages was anything but a gentle fairy tale. For most people, whether they were poor farmers or even well-off merchants, daily existence was a battle. Squalor, disease, and violence were just normal parts of life. The list of problems they faced every single day was endless. The food was often scarce and sometimes spoiled. The sanitation was so bad that the streets were basically open sewers. Crime was rampant, and justice was often swift and brutal. The summers could be scorching hot, leading to drought and failed crops, while the winters were bone-chillingly cold, a spirit-crushing season where many of the old and sick simply wouldn't wake up. And hanging over all of this was the constant fear of death from a simple accident, a sudden war, or a terrifying disease that nobody understood. Of course, some places were worse than others. There were corners of this medieval world that were true hellscapes on earth, places where only the strongest, the luckiest, or maybe the most truthless had any hope of surviving. In the darkest pits of human suffering, you'd find crumbling, decrepit prisons filled with broken captives. You'd see putrid plague hospitals overflowing with the doomed and the dying. You might even find desolate monasteries, where holy men fought lonely, desperate battles against their own doubt and despair. We're going to visit some of these forsaken places and meet some of the ill-fated souls who called them home. We'll try to walk a mile in their worn-out, louse-ridden shoes to get a richer understanding of their hardships, their heartaches, and the small, hard-won joys that kept them going. Our first stop is a city. Let's travel back to London in the year 1272. This isn't the grand, sprawling London we know today. This is a city of about 80,000 people, all packed together inside its ancient walls, a chaotic maze of crooked lanes and rickety wooden tenement buildings that lean against each other for support. The moment you step into this city, the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's an overpowering stench that clings to the air, a mix of human waste from chamber pots being emptied out of windows, rotting animal entrails tossed into the street from butcher shops, and the thick, greasy smoke from thousands of open cook fires and workshops. The air is so heavy, you can almost taste it. Open gutters run down the middle of the streets, but they aren't carrying just train water. They are rivers of filth, oozing slowly towards the Thames, pooling in noxious bogs that buzz with thick clouds of flies. To make matters worse, livestock like pigs, chickens, and even cows roam freely, adding their own waste to the already foul streets. For the common person living here, home is a simple, ramshackle affair. Imagine a 1 or 2 room hovel with low ceilings that you have to duck under, windows with no glass but just wooden shutters, and a floor made of packed dirt that's been strewn with old rushes. This dirt floor is rarely changed, so over time it becomes a compressed mat of filth, food scraps, and goodness knows what else. In a space this small, an entire family has to live their whole lives. They eat, sleep, and often work in suffocating proximity to one another. There's very little fresh water, which has to be hauled from a communal well that is often contaminated. There's little warmth, except from a smoky open hearth in the middle of the room. And there's almost no ventilation, so the air is always stale and smoky. Their clothes and bedding are usually tattered and crawling with fleas and lice. The constant, clawing wood smoke stings your eyes and makes you cough, but it's not even strong enough to mask the smell of unwashed bodies crammed together. This was the brutal reality of life in the Middle Ages for so many. If this wasn't miserable enough, living in such close quarters was like living in an incubator for disease. Common sicknesses that we barely worry about today, like the measles or the flu, could be a death sentence here. And then there were the periodic horrors of leprosy and the plague. Even a simple cut from a tulora fall in the street could turn deadly, as there was no understanding of germs or proper hygiene. The untreated sewage from the streets would seep into the ground and poison the wells, unleashing devastating waves of dysentery and cholera that could wipe out entire families. And for those who somehow managed to avoid dying from disease, there was another constant danger: fire. In a city built almost entirely of wood, with open fires in every home, a single stray spark could, and often did, lead to a massive fire that would rampage through entire blocks, consuming homes and lives in a matter of hours. Let's try to put a face to this suffering. Consider the life of a man named Will Fletcher. He's a bowmaker, a humble man who loves his family more than anything. Every single day, he has to wake up long before the sun rises to start his work in the cramped front room of his tiny home. He spends his day crafting longbows from yew and ash wood, surrounded by heaps of wood shavings and the sharp, pungent smell of the rendered animal glue he uses. It's skilled work, but it's also exhausting, and the pay is barely enough to get by. His wife, Joan, and their 3 young children share the tiny back room, which also doubles as their kitchen. All their meals are cooked over an open fire pit in the center of the room, which fills the small space with a thick, choking smoke. That smoke seeps into everything they own: the rough woolen sheets on their shared bed, the mildewed straw mattress they all sleep on, and the very clothes on their backs. Their youngest son, little Jack, has a hacking cough that never seems to go away. It keeps the whole family awake at night and fills Will and Joan with the terrifying fear of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. His 2 older sisters are constantly sniffling and scratching at the weeping sores left by a recent bout of pox. Will dreams of a better life. He wishes he could afford a proper stone house on a quieter, cleaner street, but his meager earnings barely cover the rent for their hovel and the cost of the cheap bread and ale that make up most of their meals. He lives in a state of constant, low-grade fear. He's afraid of drawing the unwanted attention of the ruthless tax collector who could take what little he has. He's afraid of running afoul of the powerful guild that controls his trade, which could strip him of his livelihood in an instant. So, he just soldiers on, day after day. He finds his few, fleeting moments of joy in a stolen embrace with Joan after the children are asleep, or in a brief walk along the banks of the River Thames at twilight, watching the lights of the city twinkle on the water. It's a threadbare existence, to be sure, but Will knows that it's still better than the squalid misery of London's absolute worst quarters, places where even these small, simple comforts are nothing but an impossible dream. For those who simply couldn't bear the squalor and chaos of city life, the options were incredibly limited. You couldn't just pack up and move to a new town to start over. For some, the only escape seemed to be a retreat from the world itself. They fled to remote monasteries, hoping to find some kind of solace in a life of quiet contemplation and prayer. Imagine you are a weary traveler who has been walking for days. You finally approach one of these monasteries, perched precariously on a windswept cliff overlooking a stormy sea. As you get closer, you can see the old stone walls, pitted and worn by centuries of harsh wind and rain. A few monks in black robes are toiling silently in small garden plots, trying to coax what little food they can from the thin, rocky soil. You are greeted at the main gate by the abbot, a severe-looking man with a face full of deep lines and eyes that seem to pierce right through you. He welcomes you, as the rules of Saint Benedict require hospitality to be shown to all visitors, but there's no real warmth in his words. You can immediately sense that life here is not about comfort or companionship. It's about discipline, deprivation, and duty. The abbot leads you into the heart of the monastery, and it feels like stepping into another world, a world of cold stone, long, dark corridors, and the faint, flickering light of candles, the sound of solemn, plain chant echoes hauntingly through a cavernous chapel as the monks gather for their evening prayers, known as Vespers. Later, in the dining hall, or refectory, you are served a meager meal of thin gruel and a piece of hard, stale bread. The meal is eaten in total, absolute silence. You learn quickly that even idle chatter is strictly forbidden and harshly punished. As the sun finally sets over the bleak cliffs and a cold sea mist trolls in, you are shown to the guest house. It's not much of a house, really more of a damp, cold cell with a straw pallet on the floor for a bed. Shivering in the gloom, you can't help but marvel at the incredible fortitude it must take to endure such an austere, harsh existence, day after day, year after year. What kind of deep conviction, or perhaps what kind of desperation, could possibly compel someone to choose a life of such complete self-denial? One man who might have an answer is Brother Adolmo, having seen nearly 70 winters. He is the oldest monk in the entire abbey. His back is permanently bent from decades spent hunched over in the scriptorium, the room where monks would meticulously copy and illuminate manuscripts by hand. His eyes are watery and his hands are gnarled with age, but his mind is still as sharp as the well-honed quill he used for so many years. In a rare moment of rest, you find yourself sitting with him, and he begins to tell you his story. He explains how he came to the monastery as a young man, fleeing from a broken heart and what he calls a life of sin. He had dreamed of finding peace and a true purpose in serving God. But as the decades slowly passed in a monotonous blur of prayers, chores, and crushing solitude, doubts began to creep into his mind. Had he truly been called by God to live this life? Or was he simply running away from his past? Was this fortress of faith actually a prison he had built for himself? Now, with the end of his earthly life looming, Brother Adolmo finds himself grappling with unsettling questions that disturb his meditations and keep him awake during the long, cold nights. Did he waste the precious gift of life locked away within these confining walls? Will all the sacrifices he made, and all the suffering he endured for the glory of God, actually be enough to earn him a place in heaven? The old monk lets out a deep sigh, and the sound seems to merge with the whistling wind outside the thick stone walls. As you bid Brother Adolmo good night and retire to your cold cell, his words echo in your mind. A life of contemplation and devotion might bring some people closer to the divine, but you realize that the profound hardships and deep isolation of a place like this remote monastery also carry their own kind of quiet, knowing anguish. It becomes clear that even those who dedicated their entire lives to a higher calling were not immune to the very human feelings of loneliness, doubt, and regret. Sleep is slow to come as you lie there, pondering the great paradox of monastic life. It was meant to be a refuge from the cruelties of the world, but it could also become a prison of its own making. As your eyes finally close, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below lulls you into a restless slumber, you dream of the countless, nameless scribes like Adolmo, hunched over parchment by the light of a guttering candle, preserving knowledge through the centuries. Theirs was a cloistered, lonely existence we can scarcely imagine today, yet their diligence and their faith ensured that the light of knowledge survived through even the darkest of ages. But monasteries, as remote and restrictive as they could be, were a far cry from the only challenging frontiers of the medieval world. For the monks inside, their life of hardship was a choice, a path they walked in search of salvation. For many others, however, living on the edge of civilization wasn't a choice at all, it was a brutal reality they were born into, a daily struggle for survival in the shadow of constant, bloody conflict. Let's travel now to a different kind of desolate place. Picture the bleak, windswept marches of northern England, sometime in the early 12th century. The morning fog hangs low and cold over muddy, barren fields. It's a landscape scarred by war, where every hill could be hiding an enemy and every patch of woods could conceal an ambush. From a half-collapsed hovel, a hut made of wattle and daub that looks like it could be pushed over by a strong gust of wind, an old woman emerges. Her name is Alara, and at nearly 60 winters, she has seen far more than her share of hardship and sorrow. Alara's eyes, tired and faded, slowly scan what's left of her village. It's not much more than a handful of ramshackle huts, all clustered around the charred, skeletal remains of a tiny chapel. The place never even had a proper name. It was always too small and insignificant to be put on any map. Now, After the last brutal raid by Scottish warriors from the north, it barely qualifies as a hamlet at all. Picking her way carefully through the churned-up mud and burnt debris, Elara heads towards the meager garden plot behind her hut. This tiny patch of earth is all that stands between her and starvation. As she bends down, her old bones groaning in protest, to pull a few withered turnips from the hard, unforgiving ground, her mind drifts back. She remembers the fateful night, just a moon ago, the sudden, panicked shouts that shattered the quiet darkness, the terrifying sound of pounding hooves growing closer and closer, the flickering orange light of torches appearing over the hill. The raiders came fast and without mercy. They were not the noble knights you hear about in stories. There are plenty of videos out there titled something like "What Made This Night the Most Feared in History," but these men were different. They were killers and thieves. They threw burning branches onto the thatched roofs of the huts and drove off the few scrawny sheep and cattle the villagers owned. Elara's mind flashes to poor Edric, the village reeve, a good man, a brave man, who was cut down in a futile attempt to rally some kind of defense. His body still lies where it fell, by the ruined chapel, a gruesome reminder of the attack. Most of the other survivors fled in the chaos of that night, making a desperate journey towards the relative safety of the walled town, a full day's walk to the south. But Elara remains. She is routed to this miserable scrap of land like one of her own stubbornly tenacious turnips. Where else would she go? This hovel, as wretched as it is, has been her home for 40 years. Ever since she arrived as a young bride, full of hopes and dreams, ready to raise a family and carve out a life on this unforgiving frontier, she stayed here through the bitter years after her husband was conscripted by a local lord, forced to go and fight in some nameless skirmish to the north, never to return. She endured the harsh winter when her youngest son, her last bit of joy, sickened and wasted away from the bloody flux, a terrible intestinal disease, and she persisted, even as most of her neighbors gave up one by one, seeking safer, better prospects elsewhere. This land, as hard and as cruel as it is the only home Elara has ever known. Every rock and every crooked tree holds a memory. So here she remains, a lonely old woman, scratching out a meager existence from an unyielding earth, in a place that is constantly balanced on a knife's edge between survival and total oblivion. As she straightens up painfully, clutching the few precious, small turnips in her hand, Elara gazes towards the leaden gray horizon. She doesn't hope for much. She only hopes that the raiders, or the plague, or simple starvation will hold off just long enough for her to see one more spring. Such was the precarious, fragile life of so many people living in these lawless and unforgiving borderlands of medieval Europe. In our next scene, we will journey even further, to the very edges of the known medieval world. We'll discover the perils and the deep miseries of life in a remote and poorly supplied colonial outpost. Brace yourself for a bleak journey across stormy seas to a destination that promised a new beginning, but for most, delivered nothing but untold suffering and despair. A place that could break even the hardiest of souls. But before we get there, we must first descend into the darkness, deep into the cold, damp stone heart of the medieval castle, to a place where sunlight never reaches and hope goes to die. The dungeons of medieval castles were truly violent, wretched places, the absolute lowest level of an already strictly hierarchical and brutal society. Damp, dark, and claustrophobic, these subterranean chambers were reserved for the most reviled members of the community, traitors, heretics, debtors, and any petty criminals unfortunate enough to find themselves on the wrong side of the local lord's idea of justice. For those condemned to languish in these dank holes, life was a daily, desperate struggle against hunger, disease, and a despair so profound it could shatter the mind. The stale air reeked of mold, rotting straw, and human waste. Vermin, mostly rats and insects, scurried in the shadows, feeding on any scraps they could find and, occasionally, on the inmates themselves. The only light, if any, seeped in through tiny, barred windows set high in the stone walls. And at night, the darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow all sound and hope. The typical dungeon was little more than a stone vault, divided into cramped cells by rusting iron gates or heavy wooden doors. Manacles, bolted directly to the walls, were used to restrain the most dangerous or troublesome prisoners. There was no furniture to speak of, maybe just a fetid pile of old straw on the floor to serve as a makeshift bed. And the jailers, they were often as cold and unyielding as the stone walls, quick to use a whip or withhold the meager rations for even the slightest provocation. It is nearly impossible for us to imagine the sheer anguish and alienation endured by the people trapped in these dismal, forgotten holes. Ponder for a moment the story of Thomas, a young peasant farmer who was wrongfully accused of poaching deer on the Lord's land by a merciless nobleman. Ripped from the arms of his wife and their infant son, Thomas was dragged in chains to the bowels of the castle. There, he was thrown into a cramped, stinking cell that he was forced to share with 2 other men, wretches who were already half-starved and looked more like ghosts than living beings. As the heavy door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into a stifling, oppressive darkness, the horrible reality of his situation began to sink in like a cold stone in his stomach. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks blurred into an endless, monotonous cycle of gnawing hunger, shivering cold, and fitful, nightmare-filled sleep on the damp stone floor. His cellmates, broken and emaciated, rarely spoke. They had long ago exhausted their own tales of misery and misfortune. Deprived of all human comfort and dignity, Thomas felt his own mind begin to fray at the edges. He wept silently for his family, praying they would somehow find a way to survive without him. He cursed the nobleman who had condemned him to this living hell, fantasizing about a bloody revenge he knew he would never get to enact, even as he grew weaker with each passing day. But the worst part of it all was the crushing knowledge that he would likely die here, in this filthy hole, never again to see the sun or breathe fresh air. His loved ones would never even know what happened to him. He would simply vanish from the world. As the faint sounds of life from the castle above filtered down through the thick stonia, the distant clatter of dishes from a feast, snippets of muffled conversation, sometimes even a snatch of music from a minstrel's lute, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the cruel randomness of life. He realized how terrifyingly thin the line was between the lords and ladies living in luxury, dressed in their fine silks and furs, and the miserable wretches like him, rotting away in the darkness just a few feet beneath their feet. In the dungeon, stripped of all pretense, the stark, brutal inequality of the age was laid bare for all to see. Perhaps the most soul-crushing thing of all for a prisoner like Thomas was the sheer, suffocating hopelessness of his situation. In our world, we have legal systems, appeals, and the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. In the medieval dungeon, there was none of that. There was no recourse to appeal your sentence, no one to plead your case. Once you were thrown into that hole, you were forgotten by the world above. All you could do was pray for some kind of miracle, or, more likely, for a quick and final end to your suffering. It's no wonder that many prisoners simply lost their minds. They would rave in the darkness, shouting at phantoms only they could see, gibbering incoherently until merciful death finally claimed them. Others just wasted away in silence, their emaciated corpses sometimes lying for days before the guards even bothered to drag them out. These scenes of misery and despair were not just happening in 1 or 2 castles. They were playing out in dungeons all across medieval Europe, from the infamous Tower of London to the forgotten oubliettes of France and the chilling prisons of Lithuania. While the specific details might have varied from place to place, the overarching cruelty and coldness was always the same. It was a brutal reflection of the harshness of the age itself. For those who entered these dreadful dungeons, hope and humanity were things that remained firmly shut outside the heavy, bolted door. Of course, dungeons weren't only found in the castles of powerful lords. Many medieval cities and towns had their own prisons and jails, sometimes hidden away beneath government buildings or tucked into the foundations of the towering city walls. And these municipal dungeons could be every bit as horrid as their castle counterparts. They were often overcrowded, underlit dens of appalling squalor. Particularly infamous were the dungeons of the Bastille in Paris. This looming, grim fortress on the edge of the city became a terrifying symbol of royal cruelty and absolute power. Its windowless cells, some of which would actually flood with filthy river water every time it rained, were crammed with political dissidents, free thinkers, and anyone who had simply offended the increasingly powerful and volatile French monarchy. The famous writer and philosopher Voltaire spent nearly a year entombed in the Bastille, and while his social status meant he got slightly better treatment than the average prisoner, he still had to endure drafty, vermin-infested quarters and the constant, chilling sounds of other tormented inmates crying out in the darkness. The experience left a permanent mark on him, and his later writings were filled with a burning contempt for the callous tyranny of French royal justice. Over in England, the Fleet Prison in London became notorious for its horrendous conditions and systematic corruption. On the surface, it was a prison for debtors, people who couldn't pay what they owed. But in reality, the Fleet was a filthy, decrepit labyrinth where the inmates were shaken down for every last penny by predatory wardens. They were subjected to all manner of abuse and extortion. For those who didn't have the money to pay the exorbitant fees for food, bedding, and other basic necessities, life inside the Fleet Prison could be far worse than death. This system created a living hell where the poor were punished for their poverty, trapped in a cycle of debt and suffering with no way out. And it wasn't just physical suffering. In some castles, the dungeon was more than just a holding cell. It was a place of active, calculated cruelty. We've all heard tales of so-called torture chambers, and while some of the more gruesome stories might be exaggerated, the reality was grim enough. Suspected traitors, heretics, or enemies of the state could be subjected to brutal interrogations using devices designed to inflict maximum pain. Things like the rack, which would slowly stretch a person's body until their joints dislocated, or the Judas cradle, were tools of terror used under the sadistic eye of professional torturers to extract confessions, true or not. But was there ever any escape, any hope? It was incredibly rare, but not impossible. There's a famous account from 1385 that tells the story of a French knight named Jean de Carriges. He was imprisoned by his rival, Jacques Legris, in the dungeons of a small castle in Normandy. For weeks, Carriges was shackled to the walls in heavy irons, forced to subsist on meager rations of stale bread and foul water, while filthy rats gnawed at his legs in the dark. According to the chronicles, when Carriges was finally brought before his captor, he looked like a miserable sack of bones, scarcely recognizable as a man. Yet, his burning desire for vengeance kept him alive. In a shocking turn of events, Carriges managed to secure his release just long enough to challenge Legris to a judicial duel, a trial by combat. Before a massive crowd, he fought and killed his former jailer, washing away the stain on his honor with blood. But for every story like that, there are thousands with no such ending. Most prisoners could only dream of vindication. Their bleak, and all too short, lives ended in squalor, forgotten in some dark, earthen hole. This brings us to perhaps the most famous dungeon prisoner of the entire era, a mysterious figure who has captivated historians and storytellers for centuries. His story is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, the kind you often see in videos titled The Unsolved Mystery of the Man in the Iron Mask. According to the legend, this unidentified man was arrested in 1669 under direct orders from King Louis XIV of France himself. What terrible crime he committed, or what secret he knew, has been lost to history. Some have speculated he was the king's disgraced older brother, or maybe the illegitimate child of a royal mistress who posed a threat to the throne. Whatever the reason, it was decreed that his true identity should never, ever be revealed. And so, this enigmatic prisoner spent over 3 decades confined in the dungeons of several different French prisons, always under heavy guard. And most bizarrely of all, he was forced to wear an iron mask at all times. Not a cloth mask, but one made of black velvet over an iron frame that completely concealed his face from anyone he encountered. He was never allowed to take it off, not even while eating or sleeping. He was never called by a name, only referred to by a number. Prisoner number 64,389,000. While the complete, true story may never be known, the mythic tale of the man in the iron mask came to symbolize the deep mystery, the chilling dread, and the absolute, cruel power wielded by monarchs in this age. For centuries, the silent screams and strangled moans of dungeon prisoners haunted the thick castle walls like vengeful ghosts. Their desperate voices from the past remained trapped in those long-abandoned vaults of stone and iron, a mute testimony to the darkest corners of the medieval world. Yet, As bleak and terrifying as the dungeons undoubtedly were, they were sadly just one of many terrible places a medieval peasant or foot soldier might find themselves trapped, hungry, and hopeless. Because when two medieval lords had a falling out over a piece of land, a pile of gold, or a simple matter of pride, it was always the lowliest people in society who suffered the most. This brings us to the unique and prolonged misery of the siege. A siege was a brutal, ugly affair. In a typical scenario, an invading army would surround their rival's castle and essentially set up camp right outside the walls. Their goal was simple: wait until the enemy either surrendered or everyone inside starved to death. It was a grim waiting game, a battle of wills and resources. The besieging army would construct its own crude fortifications, ditches, wooden walls, and watchtowers to protect themselves from attack and, more importantly, to prevent any aid or supplies from reaching the trapped defenders inside the castle. Massive war machines like catapults and siege towers would be painstakingly assembled, designed to hurl giant rocks or allow soldiers to assault the high walls from a distance. Sometimes, miners would be put to work, digging dark, dangerous tunnels to try and collapse the fortifications from beneath. This grim status quo could drag on for months, and in some rare cases, even years. With each passing day, both sides would grow more and more desperate. The misery of daily life in one of these siege camps is difficult for us to overstate. Foraging and pillaging the surrounding countryside for food could only sustain the invading army for so long. Eventually, they would strip the land bare, and then the real hunger would set in. Supply lines, which were just long wagon trains on muddy, dangerous roads, were notoriously unreliable. Food shortages and the constant specter of famine haunted the soldiers. But hunger wasn't the only enemy. With so many soldiers crammed together in a confined space, living alongside their animals, their garbage, and their own dead, disease spread like wildfire. The camp would become a sea of mud and filth. Dysentery, cholera, and typhus, diseases we now associate with the poorest parts of the world, would cut down young, strong warriors in their prime, rotting them from the inside out. There was very little a medieval army physician could do but apply leeches and offer prayers. An anonymous poem from the 14th century vividly describes the wretched scene. In the siege camp, life is hell. Knee-deep in filth and vomit well, pale wasting troops with sunken eyes, whose sallow skin sloughs often flies. Few sieges in history were as long, or as dreadful, as the infamous siege of Candia. This took place on the island of Crete and dragged on for a staggering 21 years, from 1648 to 1669. The mighty Ottoman Empire was determined to capture the strategic port city, which was a valuable Venetian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. The walled settlement was subjected to near constant bombardment as the Ottomans slowly, patiently, strangled it into submission. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Over the course of those 2 decades, more than 70,000 Ottoman soldiers and nearly 40,000 Venetian defenders lost their lives in the conflict. And here's the most shocking part: the majority of them didn't die in glorious combat. They fell to starvation or sickness. After 21 years, Candia, which is now the modern-day city of Heraklion, finally fell to the Ottomans after a grueling final assault that itself lasted for nearly 3 years. By the end, the city was reduced to rubble. Its starved and scarred civilian survivors, stumbling out from the city gates, looked like walking ghosts. In many ways, the siege of Candia was a horrifying preview of the grinding, attritional warfare and the astronomical death tolls that would come to define modern war centuries later. For the lowly foot soldiers on the front lines of a medieval siege, there was very little hope of glory or riches. Their daily reality was just gnawing hunger, creeping disease, and the mind-numbing monotony of camp life, which was only punctuated by occasional, terrifying spasms of extreme violence and mass death. I'm sure you've seen those YouTube videos with titles like "How an Overlooked Battle Changed the World." But for the men fighting in these sieges, they weren't thinking about changing the world. They were just thinking about their next meal, or trying to stay dry in a rain-soaked tent. Even if they somehow survived the siege, they might return home traumatized, crippled, or permanently disfigured, with little to nothing to show for their immense suffering. The unimaginable hardships of siege warfare left a deep and permanent scar on the popular memory of the Middle Ages. In fact, in 1874, nearly 200 years after the last great siege of that period, the Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky wrote his famous piece, Pictures at an Exhibition. The thunderous and dissonant 10th movement of that piece was directly inspired by the legend of an evil witch who was said to feast on the souls of doomed medieval soldiers. It's a dark, powerful piece of music that perfectly captures the hellish reality of that world. So while our fairy tales might be filled with gallant knights and chivalrous heroes winning glorious battles, the reality for the vast majority of medieval soldiers was as dark and hellish as the deepest dungeon. The ugly, pointless nature of their sacrifice has largely been scrubbed from our collective idea of the Middle Ages. But their bleak, forgotten struggle deserves to be remembered. And yet, my weary travelers, as terrible as the lot of the common soldier was, it paled in comparison to the very lowest of the low in medieval society, the serfs and slaves whose bondage and backbreaking labor made all of this ceaseless warfare possible in the first place. They were chained not by iron, but by the invisible shackles of the feudal system, a system designed to keep them bound to the land, and to their masters, forever. Now, as we gaze out across another isolated frontier, let's step into the shoes of those tasked with guarding the very edges of their world. Imagine the sun sinking slowly over a horizon of barren, rolling hills. A chill wind whips across the landscape, carrying with it the faint, smoky scent of distant settlements. This is what life was like at an outer reaches outpost. A hard, lonely, and often brutally short existence. You see, for many poor souls, their lot in life was to man the watchtowers and crumbling forts far removed from the relative comforts and security of the big cities and towns. Out here on the borderlands, the thin line between rival kingdoms or the very edge of what was considered civilization, you were at the mercy of not only the harsh elements but also the cruelty and unpredictable whims of mankind. Let's consider the tale of Alaric, a battle-scarred mercenary who has seen more than his share of violence and tragedy. As a young man, Alaric was conscripted, basically forced, into the army of a petty lord, a man who was really more of a glorified bandit than a true nobleman. For years, Alaric fought for this brute, raiding small villages and burning crops, all while watching his friends and comrades fall in the name of someone else's greed and ambition. But what choice did he really have? Back then, it was either the soldier's life or the beggar's bowl. Now, with his best years behind him, his body aching and his spirit weary, Alaric finds himself stationed in a crumbling, half-ruined fort. His job is to keep watch for the very same kinds of raiders and bandits that he himself once rode with. The bitter irony is not lost on him as he stares out across the desolate hills, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. But he takes his duties seriously, because he knows all too well the terrible suffering that can be unleashed upon innocent people. Life here on the borderlands is a far cry from the pageantry and glory that was promised to young men who took up the sword and shield. The days are incredibly long and monotonous. The food rations are meager and often spoiled. The company is rough. Alaric has seen more than one fresh-faced recruiter arrive, his eyes filled with dreams of valor and riches, only to be broken by the grim, unforgiving reality of this posting. Some desert, simply fleeing into the night, never to be seen again. Others just withdraw into themselves, their eyes becoming haunted and empty, filled with the things they've witnessed. For Alaric, there's a certain grim camaraderie that has formed amongst the men he serves with. They are all survivors in their own way, clinging to whatever small shreds of humanity they have left. In the evenings, they huddle around a meager, smoky fire, swapping stories of past battles and fallen comrades. Their laughter is always tinged with a dark, gallows humor, the kind of humor that only belongs to those who live each day knowing it could very well be their last. And yet, even in the middle of all this bleakness, there are fleeting moments of surprising beauty and grace. The way the morning mist clings to the hillsides, shrouding the land in a silent, ethereal glow. The unexpected kindness of a local shepherd, who might offer a portion of his own meager provisions to the weary soldiers. The haunting strains of a minstrel's lute drifting up from the valley below, a faint, beautiful sound that serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit somehow endures. But these moments are always fleeting. and the harsh realities of life on the borderlands always come crashing back. There are the constant raids and skirmishes, the terrifying clash of steel on steel, and the chilling cries of the wounded and the dying. There is the soul-crushing tedium of endless watches, just staring out into the darkness, your senses on high alert for the first signs of danger. And there is the gnawing, ever-present knowledge that one misstep, one moment of inattention, could mean the difference between life and death. For Alaric, this life has taken a profound toll. His body is a roadmap of scars from 100 different battles. His mind carries the heavy weight of countless horrors he has witnessed. He knows, deep down, that he will likely meet his end out here, on some nameless patch of blood-soaked earth, far from the home and the family he can barely even remember anymore. And yet, he soldiers on. He does it for duty, for what little honor he has left, and for the slim, flickering hope that someday, somehow, he will find a measure of peace. As the last light of the day finally fades and the first stars begin to emerge in the vast, empty sky, Alaric clambers up to his post at the top of the weathered ramparts. Pulling his thin cloak tight against the biting night chill, he settles in for another long, lonely watch. His eyes scan the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. His ears strain to catch the telltale sounds of an approaching enemy. It's a lonely vigil, but it's one he knows he must keep, because out here, on the edge of the map, there are no guarantees, no certainties. There is only the knowledge that each new dawn brings with it both the promise of danger and the simple, precious chance to see another sunset. Yes, life on the medieval borderlands was absolutely not for the faint of heart. It took a special kind of grit, a unique blend of rugged resilience and quiet resignation, to endure such an existence. And yet, for men like Alaric, it was the only life they knew. They were the watchers on the walls, the guardians in the night. They were the unsung heroes who stood as a thin, fragile line between what passed for civilization and the chaos that constantly threatened to engulf it. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, safe and warm in your modern bed, maybe spare a thought for those forgotten souls like Alaric, who manned the lonely ramparts and walked the dark roads of the medieval frontier. Their struggles, their sacrifices, and their small acts of courage and compassion, these are the threads that make up the rich tapestry of our shared history. And in honoring their memory, we keep alive the flame of human resilience that has carried us through the darkest of times and into the light of a new day. But the borderlands were not the only places where life was harsh and unforgiving in the medieval world. For those who decided to take to the seas, seeking fortune or a new life in distant, unknown lands, an even more perilous existence often awaited. The journey to the farthest reaches of the known world was incredibly long and fraught with danger. And for those who actually survived to reach the new colonies, they often found that the reality of life there was a far cry from the glittering promises of riches and glory they had been sold. Imagine you are a young man named John, born into a poor family in the bustling port city of Bristol, England. All your life, you've heard the stories, the whispers and rumors of the New World, a land of endless opportunity, a place where a man could make his fortune and rise above the station he was born into. Seduced by these incredible tales, which sound a lot like the plot of a video you might see on YouTube called How This Poor Farmer Became a King, you decide to take the ultimate gamble. You sign on as a laborer with the company of settlers, bound for the distant shores of the Americas. The voyage itself is hell on earth. For weeks on end, you are crammed into the dark, damp, and foul-smelling hold of the ship. You are surrounded by the constant stench of unwashed bodies, the groans of the seasick, and the creaking of the ship's timbers. The food is meager and often rotten, crawling with weevils. The water is brackish and foul, barely drinkable. Disease spreads quickly in such close quarters. Many of your fellow passengers succumb to sickness or simple despair, their bodies unceremoniously wrapped in a canvas sack and consigned to the depths of the ocean. By the time you finally make landfall, you are a mere shadow of your former self, weakened by hunger and illness. But the true ordeal is only just beginning. The colony you find yourself in is nothing like the paradise you were promised. The settlement is little more than a collection of ramshackle, hastily built huts, surrounded by a vast and hostile wilderness. The indigenous people, far from welcoming the newcomers with open arms, view them with deep suspicion and hostility, and with good reason. The colonists, desperate and often starving, frequently resort to violence and theft just to sustain themselves, raiding native villages for food and supplies. Life in the colony becomes a constant, grinding struggle against the elements, against disease, and against a rising tide of desperation. The work is back-breaking. From dawn until dusk, you are clearing dense forest, tilling unforgiving soil, and building crude defenses. The conditions are squalid. Many of the settlers, completely unprepared for the sheer rigor of this new life, quickly succumb to malnutrition, exhaustion, or the myriad of strange new illnesses that stalk the camp. You watch in horror as your comrades, the people you crossed an ocean with, die off one by one. Their dreams of riches and glory are shattered on the unforgiving shores of this new world. And yet, even in the midst of all this misery, you notice that there are some who seem to prosper. The leaders of the colony, the very men who brought you here with their grandiose visions and silver-tongued promises, seem to thrive on the suffering of others. They live in relative comfort, their huts larger and better provisioned, while the rest of you toil and starve. They enforce their rule with an iron fist, handing out harsh, brutal punishments for the slightest infractions. In this lawless, God-forsaken place, their word is the only law. For you, John, each day becomes a sheer test of endurance and will. You rise with the sun to tend the meager crops, your hands blistered and bleeding from the unaccustomed labor. You forage in the dense woods for anything edible to supplement the dwindling rations, always on alert for the sound of hostile tribesmen or the growl of a prowling predator. At night, huddled in your drafty, leaky shack, you dream of home. You dream of the bustling streets of Bristol, the warmth of your mother's hearth, the easy companionship of your old friends and family. They all seem like distant, fading memories now, growing dimmer with each passing day. And yet, despite all the hardships, you persevere. There is a stubborn streak in you, a refusal to surrender to despair. You find solace in the small, unexpected moments of beauty and grace that somehow manage to punctuate the bleakness. The way the morning mist clings to the ancient trees, turning the forest into a silent, magical cathedral. The unexpected kindness of a fellow settler, sharing their own meager ration when they see you are at your weakest. The haunting strains of a song from home, sung softly around the evening fire, a melody that ties you all together in your shared struggle. These small moments remind you of your humanity, of the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of even the most daunting adversity. As the weeks turn into months, and the months into years, you find yourself changed by this place, by this life. Your hands are calloused now, no longer the soft hands of a city boy. Your skin is weathered by the sun and the wind. You've learned to hunt and trap, to navigate the dense, disorienting forests, and to read the signs of the seasons. And though you still dream of home, a part of you has grown attached to this wild, untamed land, to the raw freedom and the constant challenges it represents. For better or for worse, this is your life now. You are a survivor, you are a pioneer, you are a man who has been forged in the crucible of the new world. Your story, John, is the story of countless others who ventured into the great unknown, driven by hope, by desperation, or by sheer, stubborn will. It is a story of immense suffering and sacrifice, of incredible courage and resilience in the face of almost unimaginable odds. And it is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, in the most God-forsaken corners of the earth, the human spirit endures. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to those distant shores, to the lonely outposts and struggling settlements that dotted the fringes of the known world. Imagine the faces of the men and women who lived and died there, their dreams and their fears, their small moments of triumph and their overwhelming moments of despair. In their stories, we find echoes of our own modern struggles and aspirations, powerful reminders of the indomitable will that has carried our species through the ages. And so, as the night closes in and the world grows still, take a moment of comfort in the knowledge that you are the beneficiary of their sacrifices, the inheritor of their resilient spirit. In the warmth and safety of your bed, in the soft glow of the modern world, their legacy lives an testament to the enduring power of the human heart to hope, to dream, and to persevere against all odds. But the hardships of the medieval world were not just confined to those distant outposts and dangerous frontier settlements. Even within the very heart of civilization, Inside the grand castles and fortified manor houses that dotted the European landscape, life could be incredibly harsh, unforgiving, and rife with its own unique set of dangers. Let's consider the tale of a young girl named Alara. She's a scullery maid, which is the lowest ranking servant, in the service of a powerful feudal lord. Hers is a life of endless, mind-numbing toil and drudgery. Her days are spent scrubbing heavy iron pots caked with grease, hauling massive buckets of water from the castle well, and stoking the great, roaring fires of the castle kitchen. From long before the sun rises until deep into the night, she labors under the watchful, and often cruel, eye of the head cook, a tyrannical woman known for her quick temper and a heavy hand that isn't afraid to strike. For Alara, the castle is a world unto itself. It's a labyrinthine stone edifice, filled with long, dark corridors, draughty great halls, and cramped, windowless servants' quarters tucked away in the coldest parts of the castle. She navigates this gloomy realm with the sure-footedness of one who was born into servitude. Her bare feet are calloused and tough from the cold flagstone floors. Her hands are chapped and raw from endless immersion in scalding water and harsh lye soap. Life in the scullery is a world away from the glittering, privileged life of the nobles who inhabit the castle's upper reaches. While they feast on rich meats, drink fine wines, and eat delicate pastries, Alara and her fellow servants subsist on a meager diet of stale bread, thin gruel, and whatever scraps can be scavenged from the nobles' plates after a feast. While the lord and lady sleep on soft feather beds, swaddled in expensive furs and fine linens, the servants huddle together on simple pallets of straw in the communal room, shivering beneath thin, patched blankets. And yet, for all the hardships, there is a certain camaraderie that exists among the castle's serving class. In the rare, precious moments of rest they get between their duties, they gather in the relative warmth of the kitchen or out in the courtyards. They share stories, they gossip about the nobles, and they whisper their dreams of a better life. Alara finds a deep solace in these moments, in the shared laughter and the quiet tears of her fellow servants, in the simple, powerful knowledge that she is not alone in her struggles. But even these fleeting moments of rest are tainted by the ever-present specter of danger, for life in a medieval castle was fraught with perils, both seen and unseen. There were the constant threats of a sudden fire racing through the wooden structures, of disease sweeping through the crowded quarters, or of a siege, where they would all be trapped inside, slowly starving. And then there were the more intimate, personal dangers, the unpredictable whims and cruelties of the nobles, the constant risk of abuse or exploitation at the hands of those who held power over you. Alara has seen what can happen to a serving girl who unfortunately catches the eye of a lustful lord or a jealous lady. She has heard the whispered, fearful stories of those who simply disappeared in the night, never to be seen or spoken of again, and she lives with the constant, gnawing fear that one day, her own fate may hang in the balance of a nobleman's passing fancy or a single, careless transgression. In this world, a servant's life is cheap. Their well-being, their very existence, is completely dependent on the whims of their betters. Alara knows that she must tread carefully at all times, keep her head down, and keep her thoughts guarded. She has learned, out of necessity, to read the subtle currents of power and influence that flow through the castle, to navigate the treacherous waters of feudal politics with a deft and cautious hand. And yet, even amidst all the darkness and the danger, Alara dreams. She dreams of a different life. In the quiet, stolen moments before sleep finally claims her, she imagines a world beyond the high castle walls, a world of freedom and possibility, a world where she might be able to make her own way, to shape her own destiny. She clings to these dreams like a secret talisman, a small, secret fire that burns brightly in her heart, fueling her through the long, cold nights and the endless, exhausting days of toil. For Alara, as for so many of the forgotten souls who toiled in the great houses of the medieval world, life was a constant struggle. It was a battle against the elements, a battle against the cruelties of fate, and a battle against the whims of those who had absolute power over them. And yet, in their quiet resilience, in their incredible endurance, in their stubborn refusal to ever surrender to despair, they embodied the very essence of the human spirit. They represented that indomitable will to survive, to hope, and to always, always dream of a better tomorrow. As you drift off to sleep, Let your thoughts linger on the life of young Alara, on the courage and the quiet dignity with which she faced the endless trials of her existence. In her story, and in the stories of countless others like her whose names have been lost to history, we find a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within us all, the capacity to endure, to persevere, and to find a small glimmer of light in even the darkest of places. So rest now, and let the tales of the past become the fabric of your dreams. In the struggles and the triumphs of those who came before, we find the seeds of our own resilience, the echoes of our own indomitable spirit. But the hardships of medieval life were not confined to the realm of the living who had at least some measure of freedom. For those unfortunate souls who ran afoul of the law, or simply the whims of the powerful, an even darker fate awaited them in the dank, dismal world of the dungeon. Imagine again the plight of a man named Thomas. We met him briefly before, a simple peasant farmer, wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. He was dragged from his fields, torn from his family, and found himself thrown into a cramped, fetid cell deep in the bowels of his lord's castle. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, he is completely at the mercy of his jailers, so often cruel, corrupt men who seem to take a perverse delight in the suffering of their charges. The conditions in the dungeon are truly horrific. The air is thick and heavy with the stench of human misery. It's a foul combination of unwashed bodies, the sickly sweet smell of infection and disease, and the overpowering reek of human waste. The stone walls are slick with a constant, cold moisture. The floors are covered in a thick layer of filth and grime. Vermin scurry in the ever-present shadows, feeding on the meager scraps of food left for the prisoners. Their constant skittering and squeaking is a maddening, endless soundtrack to the degradation of this place. For Thomas, each day is a waking nightmare. The guards, when they even remember to feed him at all, simply toss him a piece of moldy bread and a jug of foul, fetid water through a slot in the door. It's barely enough to sustain life. They seem to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting him, in finding new and cruel ways to try and break his spirit and his will. They beat him, they starve him, they subject him to unspeakable humiliations, all in the name of trying to extract a confession for a crime he did not commit. And yet, even in the absolute depths of his despair, Thomas clings to one thing: his innocence. He holds on to the faint, flickering belief that somehow, someway, justice will prevail. He prays fervently in the suffocating darkness, his whispered pleas seeming to be absorbed by the damp stone walls. He dreams of his wife, and his children. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he thinks he can hear their voices calling his name, but he knows it's just his mind playing tricks on him. It's a sad truth that this was the reality for so many, a stark contrast to the dramatic tales of justice you might see in a video titled "The Trial That Shocked an Entire Kingdom." For men like Thomas, there was no trial. As we delve deeper into the dark annals of medieval history, we come to understand that these dungeons were perhaps the most feared and dreaded of all places. They were not mere prisons for holding criminals who were awaiting a fair trial or sentencing. No, the dungeons of the Middle Ages were horrific places of unimaginable suffering, despair, and often cruel, arbitrary punishment that was completely dependent on the whims of the powerful. Imagine descending a narrow, slippery stone staircase, deep beneath a towering castle. The air grows colder and danker with each step you take, down into the bowels of the earth. The only light comes from the flickering glow of torches set in iron sconces on the wall, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn stone. The stench of mold, decay, and human misery thickens until it's hard to even breathe. At the bottom, a heavy, iron-bound door creaks open, and you step into a claustrophobic, dimly lit chamber. The floor is packed dirt, cold and damp, scattered with patches of moldering straw. Filthy, haggard prisoners are shackled directly to the walls, huddled in small, silent groups or curled up alone in the fetal position. Some moan pitifully or mutter incoherently to themselves. Others just stare blankly into the darkness, their eyes seemingly devoid of all hope. This is the daily existence for the wretched souls condemned to the dungeons. Some are imprisoned for actual crimes like theft, assault, or murder, but many others are simply the victims of political rivalries, religious persecution, or the simple, terrible bad luck of being on the wrong side of someone in power. Your innocence means absolutely nothing here. Justice is a complete illusion. Slumped against the far wall is a man named Edric, a simple farmer who ran afoul of the local lord over a land dispute. Edric had the audacity to protest when the nobleman's hunting party trampled his crops and slaughtered his only livestock. For this insolence, the hapless farmer was dragged from his family and tossed into the dungeons to rot. That was 3 long years ago. Edric is now a mere shell of the man he once was. His skin is sallow and hangs loosely on his bones. His once bright, cheerful eyes are now dull and clouded by hopelessness. The jailers, when they bother to show up, bring only a few moldy scraps of bread and a filthy jug of water each day. It's no wonder that many prisoners simply stop eating, preferring to embrace the final release of death. But the physical privation, the constant hunger and cold, is not the only torment inflicted upon the residents of the dungeon. There is also the psychological torture. The notorious jailer of this particular castle, a hulking brute of a man named Oswald, is known throughout the region for his cruel streak and his twisted creativity in extracting confessions, or sometimes just for indulging his own sadistic impulses. And his collection of tools is the stuff of nightmares. Oswald takes a special, dark pleasure in working over the new prisoners. He seems to relish their terrified shrieks as he introduces them to his grim array of devices. He has thumb screws to crush their fingers, an Iron Maiden, a sarcophagus lined with spicaessa, and the infamous rack, a machine designed to slowly dislocate every joint in a person's body. Often, just the threat of these implements is enough to shatter a person's spirit and induce a babbling, desperate compliance to any accusation, no matter how false. Few prisoners in Oswald's domain dare to even dream of freedom or deliverance. Most sink into a state of grim, silent resignation. Their only hope is that death will come quickly. When that heavy cell door slams shut behind you, it is as if the entire world above, the world of sunlight and fresh air, simply ceases to exist. There is only the never-ending, suffocating nightmare of the dungeon. But even here, in the absolute depths of despair, the resilience of the human spirit sometimes manages to endure in the most unexpected ways, to pass the endless hours and keep their sanity from completely unraveling. The prisoners tell each other stories. They whisper tales to hold on to their fading memories of the outside world. They secretly share precious crumbs of their moldy bread and tiny sips of their foul water. They whisper prayers and quiet words of encouragement to one another in the dark. Our farmer, Edric, has found solace in a most unexpected way. In a forgotten corner of his cell, hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, he found a small scrap of charcoal, and in the fleeting, flickering light of the guttering torches in the corridor, he has begun to sketch on the stone walls. At first, his drawings were just crude, stick-like figures, but with practice, his pictures have grown increasingly detailed and evocative. He draws scenes from his past life, his modest little cottage, his wife's smiling face, his children playing in the sun-drenched fields. He sketches his fellow prisoners, perfectly capturing their haunted, gaunt faces. He even depicts the monstrous jailer Oswald, drawing him as a snarling, demon-like figure. It is as if by putting their horrifying reality down on the stone, he can somehow gain a small measure of control over it. His artwork doesn't go unnoticed. The other prisoners beg Edric to sketch their loved ones from their own fading descriptions, and they cling to these fragile, charcoal images as if they were holy talismans against the encroaching darkness. Amazingly, even some of the guards, hardened and cruel as they are secretly moved by his work. They begin to repay him in small ways, smuggling in extra candle stubs, more charcoal, and on very rare occasions, a few scraps of meat from the kitchens above. For Edric, his art has become a lifeline. It's a way for him to preserve his sanity and his humanity in the face of overwhelming, soul-crushing degradation. He knows he will probably die here in this hellish pit, but a part of him, the part that creates, that imagines, that can still see a sliver of beauty even in the darkest of places, if that part will live on, undefeated. The dungeons of the Middle Ages broke the bodies and crushed the souls of countless unfortunate people. They were, in many ways, a concentrated microcosm of the cruelty, the injustice, and the oppression that shadowed so much of medieval life for the powerless. But as Edric's story reminds us, there were also small, defiant glimmers of light amidst the profound darkness. The endurance of hope, the solidarity born of shared suffering, and the quiet, fierce determination to preserve one's dignity and spirit against all odds. These, too, were part of the human experience, even in the very worst of times and places. As we finally emerge from the depths of the dungeons, blinking in the harsh light of day, it's worth reflecting for a moment on the incredible resilience and the unquenchable spirit of our ancestors who somehow managed to endure such harrowing conditions. Their struggles and their small triumphs, however forgotten by history, are a powerful testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight in the profound comfort of your modern bed, spare a thought for those who came before, for those who survived the very worst that medieval life could throw at them. And perhaps in your dreams, you'll be able to sketch a brighter picture for them, one where hope and humanity finally manage to overcome the darkness. Now, it's important to remember that even those who occupied positions of power and privilege were not entirely immune to the dangers and hardships of the time. In fact, some of the most miserable existences could be found within the cold, draughty stone walls of Europe's grand castles and fortresses. Let's take, for example, the story of young William. He's a lowly servant, toiling away in the scullery of a dank castle in 13th century England. William's days are an endless, repetitive cycle of back-breaking labor. He scrubs grimy pots, hauls heavy buckets of water, and stokes the fires of the massive kitchen hearths. From before sunrise until well past sunset, he is at the beck and call of the tyrannical head cook, a short-tempered man prone to doling out swift and painful punishments for even the smallest of mistakes. Life in the castle is a far cry from the romanticized tales of chivalry and courtly love that William might have heard as a child. The living quarters for the servants are cramped, cold, and perpetually damp, with narrow slit windows that let in very little light and even less fresh air. Privacy is a luxury that few can afford, and the constant noise and bustle of the castle make it nearly impossible to ever find a moment's peace. But perhaps even more oppressive than the physical discomforts was the rigidly hierarchical society that governed every single aspect of castle life. As a lowly servant, William was at the very bottom of the pecking order. He was subject to the whims and abuses of not only the head cook but also the kitchen maids, the stable hands, and even the castle dogs, which were often better fed than he was. He quickly learned to keep his head down, his mouth shut, and to never, ever question the orders of his superiors. It was a lesson in survival. Despite the hardships, William found small moments of solace in the camaraderie of his fellow servants. In the precious few hours they had between their grueling duties, they would gather in the relative warmth of the kitchen, sharing their meager meals and swapping stories of the lives they had before coming to the castle. For many of them, it was the only family they had ever known. But even these small comforts could not ease the gnawing hunger in William's belly or the constant ache in his bones from the long hours of toil. He dreamed of a better life, of a world beyond the high castle walls where he could be his own master and live by his own rules. But deep down, he knew that such dreams were foolish. For a lowly servant in a medieval castle, there was no escape from the grim realities of daily life. As the years passed, William watched as the world outside the castle walls seemed to grow even more dangerous and unpredictable. Frightening tales of war, plague, and famine filtered in from the surrounding countryside, and the castle became increasingly fortified against the threat of attack. The once bustling courtyard was now a grim and foreboding place, patrolled by heavily armed guards and filled with the constant clatter of weapons and armor. Even the lords and ladies of the castle were not immune to the pervasive sense of fear and unease. They retreated ever deeper into their private chambers, surrounding themselves with loyal retainers and heavily armed bodyguards. The great hall, once a place of grand feasting and merriment, now often stood empty and echoing, a silent testament to the dark times that had befallen the land. For William, life in the castle had become a waking nightmare, a never-ending cycle of toil and hardship with no hope of escape. But even in his darkest moments, he clung to the small sparks of humanity that still flickered in the hearts of those around him. The kindness of a fellow servant sharing a piece of their bread, the fleeting smile of a kitchen maid across a crowded room, the gentle nuzzle of a castle dog seeking a moment of affection. These were the things that kept him going, the tiny glimmers of light in an otherwise bleak and unforgiving world. Years turned into decades, and William grew old and gray within those same castle walls. His once strong back was now stooped from a lifetime of labor, his hands gnarled and scarred from countless burns and cuts. But even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp and clear, a testament to the indomitable human spirit that had sustained him through so many trials and tribulations. Looking back on his life, William couldn't help but feel a sense of profound sadness and regret. He had been born into a world that was not of his making, a world that had used him up and cast him aside like so much refuse. But even in his darkest moments, he had never lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered, his own humanity. For in the end, he realized, it was not the grand tales of kings and queens that would endure. It was the small, everyday acts of kindness and compassion that truly made life worth living. The smile of a child, the touch of a loved one's hand, the warmth of a fire on a cold winter's night. These were the things that truly mattered, the things that would endure long after the castle walls had crumbled to dust. As William lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the faces of the other servants he had come to know and love over the years, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. He had lived a hard life, a life of almost unimaginable hardship and suffering, but he had also known moments of joy and laughter, of love and companionship. And in the end, that was enough. With a final, rattling breath, William closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, secure in the knowledge that he had lived a life worth living, even in the worst of times and the worst of places. Conclusion. And so, we reach the end of our long journey through some of history's harshest realms. We've walked the filthy streets of overcrowded cities, stood vigil on lonely, war-torn borderlands, and felt the cold despair of a deep, dark dungeon. We have sailed to desperate colonial outposts and witnessed the grim reality of a medieval siege. Each of these places, in its own way, was defined by profound hardship, cruelty, and suffering. They serve as a stark reminder that for the vast majority of people, life in the Middle Ages was often nasty, brutish, and incredibly short. But we have also seen that even in these grim, hellish places, the human spirit endured. It found moments of grace, courage, and grim resolve. The people we met along the way from Alara and her ruined village to Edric sketching on his prison wall speak to a resilience of spirit that can never be fully extinguished, even in the most hopeless of circumstances. As we bid goodnight to these shadow-cloaked figures from our distant past, we should count ourselves incredibly fortunate to enjoy comforts they couldn't even begin to imagine. Not just the physical things, our warm beds, sturdy roofs, and full beliefs, but the hard-won ideas of justice, dignity, and basic human rights that most medieval folk were utterly denied. The world, for all its modern troubles, is in so many ways a kinder, more humane place today than the one our ancestors could have ever dreamed of. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, take just a moment to appreciate these blessings, because it is only by remembering and reckoning with the darkness of the past that we can truly appreciate the light and the immense possibility of our present. The medieval world, for good and for ill, built the foundations of our own. By confronting the worst of what was, we are better equipped to imagine, and to work towards, the very best of what can be. Thank you so much for joining me on this long passage into the past. I hope this journey has given you a new perspective and maybe helped you appreciate the softness of your own pillow a little bit more tonight. If you found this exploration of forgotten history as fascinating as I did, and you want to continue uncovering the real, unvarnished stories of the people who came before us, then I'd be honored if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. My goal here at Boring History Guy is to prove that history is anything but boring when you look in the right, and often darkest, places. Until our next adventure into the past, I bid you the sweetest of dreams. Sleep well.